Late December 2025, Columbus, Ohio. The city was settling into the quiet lull that comes after the frenzy of the holiday season. Streetlights flickered over empty roads, snow glimmered faintly under the glow of lamplight, and most residents were tucked safely inside their homes, sipping hot drinks, winding down from the season's chaos. It was a time when people feel safe, when the ordinary rhythm of life seems calm, predictable, and unshakable. But in one seemingly ordinary suburban neighborhood, the illusion of safety shattered in a single, devastating night. Inside a modest, well-kept home, Monique and Spencer Tepe, a married couple known to neighbors as warm, caring, and seemingly ordinary, had been killed. Both had been shot in what police would later describe as a controlled, precise execution. Their bodies were discovered upstairs, a scene of violence that was as chilling for its calmness as for its brutality. And yet, amidst this horror, there was a detail that would haunt the community and investigators alike. The couple's two young children were inside the house at the time of the murders, sleeping, untouched, oblivious to the terror unfolding just rooms away. Their survival, miraculous in its own right, added an eerie contrast to the violent deaths of their parents, creating a tableau that was almost too horrifying to comprehend. This was not random. There were no signs of forced entry, no items missing. The house was immaculate, almost unnervingly so, as if nothing had occurred. The absence of chaos suggested one thing. Someone who knew the family well, someone with intimate knowledge of the household, had planned this. This was personal. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. Every detail we uncover in this case, every revelation, every chilling twist, will be brought to you in full. Real Crime Saga is where you will get the truth behind the headlines, and you won't want to miss a single moment of this story. Monique and Spencer Tepe's lives before that night, with a picture of careful stability. Monique was a mother first, wholly devoted to her children. Friends often described her as the kind of woman whose life revolved around her kids. Every routine was meticulously planned. Morning breakfasts, school drop-offs, extracurricular activities, bedtime stories, and the countless small moments that are often overlooked but define a child's sense of safety and love. Her dedication went beyond obligation. It was instinctive, protective, and deeply affectionate. She carried herself with a quiet warmth, the kind of presence that drew people in, made others feel seen, and made her children feel cherished. Spencer Tepe was equally dedicated, though in a different way. A dentist by profession, he was known for precision, discipline, and reliability. At home, he brought the same focus and patience to his blended family. Raising children who were not biologically his own required more than kindness. It required consistency, commitment, and a willingness to step into a role that demanded both empathy and authority. He embraced it fully, taking care to nurture trust and respect with each child. Together, Monique and Spencer had built a home that seemed ordinary to outsiders, but was extraordinary in its balance, warmth, and security. But the most ordinary lives, it seems, can sometimes be the most fragile. The first sign that something was wrong was subtle. Spencer didn't show up for work. Reliable, methodical, punctual. He was always present, always communicative. Missing one day might have seemed inconsequential in a different context. But this absence quickly triggered alarm. Calls went unanswered. Messages were ignored. Hours passed, and worry turned into a gnawing dread. Concern prompted a welfare check. Police arrived at the home. What they discovered was a scene that would shock an entire city. Upstairs, Monique and Spencer lay dead. Both had been shot, both executed. The children, meanwhile, remained in their beds, untouched and unaware. The calm of their survival only intensified the horror of the crime. No robbery, no forced entry, no chaotic struggle. Everything pointed to intentional, targeted violence. Someone who knew the family, someone who knew the house and its routines, had carried out a meticulously planned act. Investigators immediately began asking the questions that would drive the case forward. Who had access to the home? Who had motive, knowledge, and opportunity? Who could commit such violence without disturbing the children or leaving obvious evidence? And the answer, slowly, painfully, began to emerge from Monique's past. Her ex-husband, Michael McKee, a vascular surgeon living out of state, became the focus of the investigation. His professional life suggested discipline and control, yet behind that polished exterior lay a history of tension, control, and obsession that would become central to understanding this tragedy. Friends and family reported that McKee had never truly let go of his marriage. Disturbing statements were recalled, words implying Monique could never escape him, that she was always within his reach. These weren't declarations of love. They were words of obsession, of possession, and of unresolved anger. The case would take a critical turn with the discovery of surveillance footage. McKee had been seen near the Tepe home weeks before the murders, on a day when the couple was attending a football game. Investigators suspected he may have entered the property, gathering information, observing routines, and preparing. This was not an act of passion. It was a carefully orchestrated plan. When McKee was arrested in Illinois, the operation was conducted without incident. He was extradited to Ohio, charged with multiple counts of aggravated murder and aggravated burglary, and pleaded not guilty, setting the stage for a legal battle that would hinge on digital records, eyewitness accounts, and forensic evidence. Now, he remains in custody without bond. Prosecutors continue to build their case, while the defense maintains his innocence. The surviving children, the extended family, and the community continue to wait, haunted by the knowledge that the ordinary can be destroyed in an instant. This case is a chilling reminder that unresolved conflict, obsession, and abuse can escalate into unimaginable violence. Behind every headline are real people, real families, and children whose lives are forever altered. As the trial approaches, we are left to reflect on the warning signs, the patterns of control, and the devastating consequences of ignoring them. Talk about it. Share it. Be vigilant. Awareness can save lives. The Tepe murders are not just a headline. They are a stark illustration of how fragile safety can be, how obsession can devastate lives, and how ordinary, loving families can be destroyed in the blink of an eye. Justice may be delayed, but it is still being pursued. And as this story unfolds, it will continue to remind us all of the enduring need to protect the vulnerable. Monique and Spencer Tepe were not just names in a police report. They were real people, parents, partners, and members of a community. To understand the tragedy that struck their family, it's essential to step into the lives they led before that December night, to see the ordinary joys, routines, and ambitions that made them human and made their loss so devastating. Monique Tepe was the heartbeat of her household, a mother whose attention to detail extended far beyond daily chores. She lived in a state of constant awareness for her children. Friends describe her as the kind of woman whose life revolved entirely around her family's well-being. Every school assignment, every extracurricular activity, every sleepover, and every little milestone mattered to her. She noticed subtle shifts in moods, the smallest gestures that hinted at joy, worry, or fear. Monique did not just care, she anticipated. She prepared, nurtured, and protected. Her home was a sanctuary because she made it one, a place where children could grow, learn, and feel safe. Her parenting style was warm and active. She read every school newsletter, followed up on homework, and coordinated schedules to ensure her children never felt neglected. Beyond logistics, she gave time and attention. Bedtime was sacred, a nightly ritual of stories, guidance, and comfort. Friends say her children were not only cared for, but truly seen. They knew, deeply, that their mother's love was constant, unwavering, and unconditional. Monique's warmth extended beyond her children. She was deeply connected to her friends, family, and community. She celebrated the small wins in others' lives, offered comfort in moments of grief, and had a quiet way of making people feel valued and safe. Neighbors remember her for her kindness, for the way she engaged with the community, and for the way she balanced the challenges of a blended family with grace. She was not perfect, but she was steadfast, loving, and fiercely protective of those she cared for. Spencer Tepe complimented Monique in ways that made their partnership extraordinary. A dentist by profession, he approached life with precision, reliability, and calmness. At work, patients relied on him for skill and trust. At home, he translated that same discipline into his family life. Being part of a blended family was not a challenge he avoided. It was a responsibility he embraced. Spencer understood that love alone was not enough. Children needed structure, fairness, and consistency. He provided all three, ensuring that boundaries were clear but kindness was abundant. Spencer's role as a stepfather was deliberate. He worked to build trust and connection, understanding that blended families require patience, empathy, and persistence. He celebrated achievements, guided his stepchildren through challenges, and helped cultivate a household where all children felt equally valued. With Monique, he built a life that was ordinary on the surface but extraordinary in the love and stability it offered. Together, Monique and Spencer represented a rare balance. Where Monique provided warmth, nurturing, and vigilance, Spencer brought discipline, reliability, and calm. Their home was a place of quiet security, a place where children could thrive, where friends felt welcome, and where neighbors respected the sense of order and care that defined their household. Neighbors often remarked on their normalcy. The Tepe family seemed ordinary, almost unremarkable, but that ordinariness was deceptive. It was the result of careful planning, love, and daily commitment. Ordinary to outsiders, perhaps, but rich in human connection, trust, and mutual support. This ordinary life, this carefully curated sanctuary, was exactly what made the tragedy of their deaths so unbearable. Friends and colleagues remember both Monique and Spencer for their unwavering dedication to family and community. Monique was described as empathetic, intelligent, and thoughtful, always listening more than speaking, always giving more than taking. Spencer was disciplined, compassionate, and reliable, a professional who carried his integrity into his personal life, creating a balance that many admired but few could replicate. Their children, too, were deeply connected to them. The bond between parent and child was evident to anyone who saw them together. Birthdays, school events, weekend routines, all were carefully managed, imbued with love, and structured to ensure the children felt safe, happy, and supported. For the Tepe children, Monique and Spencer were not just parents. They were anchors in a world of change and uncertainty, a steady presence that gave their days meaning and security. But the tragedy that struck in December 2025 shattered not only the physical safety of the household, but also the emotional and psychological world of the children. Their parents, who had devoted their lives to protection and care, were taken in an act of violence so calculated and cold that the impact would ripple through the family and community for years to come. The suddenness of the loss magnified its horror. There was no warning, no immediate conflict, no apparent threat to foreshadow the attack. To the children, the adults who had been constants in their lives were gone in an instant, leaving them in a world now defined by uncertainty, grief, and fear. And yet, their survival was a stark, haunting contrast to the violence that had taken their parents. A small flicker of life amidst darkness, a reminder that even in tragedy, hope can persist. Monique and Spencer's deaths also sent shockwaves beyond their immediate family. Friends, neighbors, colleagues, and the wider Columbus community were left grappling with disbelief. How could such a carefully constructed life, one marked by devotion, love, and ordinary stability, be destroyed so violently? How could anyone commit such an act in the very home designed to nurture, protect, and care? This is why understanding who the victims were is so crucial. They were not just faces in a news article. They were parents, professionals, neighbors, friends, people who had woven themselves into the fabric of their community. Their ordinary, devoted lives and their tragic deaths highlight both the fragility of safety and the devastating consequences of obsession and unresolved conflict. As we move deeper into this case, the story of Monique and Spencer Tepe reminds us of what was at stake. The human lives, the routines, the love, and the care that were all destroyed in an instant. To comprehend the motives, the planning, and the eventual pursuit of justice, we must first honor and understand the lives that were taken. Because behind every statistic, every news headline, and every investigation, there are people who lived, loved, and mattered. And the Tepe family, Monique, Spencer, and their children, will forever be a reminder of the lives behind the story. It was a morning like any other in Columbus, Ohio, though the air carried the chill of winter, sharp and penetrating. Neighborhoods were quiet, children bundled in coats walked to school, and commuters began their daily journeys. But inside the Tepe household, a silence was building, one that would soon erupt into horror. The first sign that something was wrong came not with a scream or frantic call, but with absence. Spencer Tepe, reliable and methodical, did not appear at his dental practice that morning. He had never been late. He had never missed work without explanation. Patients expecting him in the office waited, called, and eventually worried. Hours passed, and the concern deepened. Messages to Spencer went unanswered. Phone calls rang through to voicemail. Even the most patient colleagues and friends felt unease rising into alarm. Something was off, something deeply wrong. When concern turned to fear, someone finally called the authorities, requesting a welfare check. Police arrived at the quiet, unassuming home. They approached with caution, aware that domestic situations could be unpredictable, but likely expecting a minor issue, a sick parent, a delayed arrival, or a simple miscommunication. What they found inside would haunt the city, the investigators, and the surviving family forever. Upon entering, officers noticed nothing immediately out of place. The home was orderly. The furniture was in place. There were no broken doors, no forced windows, no sign that a struggle had occurred. But then, the officers ascended the stairs, and the reality of the scene hit with full force. Upstairs, in a room that had been a sanctuary of family life, Monique and Spencer Tepe lay dead, both victims of gunshot wounds. The precision of the act suggested control and deliberation. There was no chaos, no flurry of activity, no random devastation, only cold, calculated violence. What made the scene even more chilling was the presence of the children. Sleeping just rooms away, they were unharmed, untouched by the violence that had claimed their parents. The contrast between the brutality upstairs and the quiet innocence of the children's sleep created a haunting tableau that would linger in the minds of investigators and the public alike. The lack of forced entry immediately shifted the investigation's focus. Whoever had committed this crime did not break in. They were either trusted by the family or had intimate knowledge of the household routines and access points. Nothing had been stolen. No valuables were missing. The house looked undisturbed. In other words, this was not a burglary gone wrong. This was something far more sinister, a deliberate, targeted act. Investigators began to ask the questions that would define the case. Who had access to the home? Who knew when the family would be away or vulnerable? Who had a motive strong enough to commit murder with such precision, yet leave the children alive? Neighbors, initially oblivious to the unfolding tragedy, soon became aware that something extraordinary and horrifying had occurred. Police vehicles lined the quiet street. News crews began to arrive, though details were scarce. Word spread through the community, first in whispers, then in disbelief. A family had been murdered inside their own home. The fact that the children survived offered a sliver of relief, yet could not soften the horror of the parents' deaths. Inside the house, investigators methodically combed the scene. Every detail was documented, every item photographed. Evidence collected would later prove crucial in connecting the crime to a suspect. Digital forensics, gunshot residue analysis, and surveillance cameras all became part of the growing mosaic of the investigation. For the children, discovery was a different reality entirely. Though physically unharmed, the psychological impact of losing both parents in such violent circumstances would be profound and lasting. Investigators later noted that children exposed to such trauma require careful, ongoing support. Yet in the moment, their survival was almost miraculous. They had been spared physically, even as their world was forever altered emotionally and psychologically. The Tepe home, once a symbol of safety and normalcy, had become the epicenter of fear, grief, and intrigue. Questions swirled. How could someone enter a home undetected? How could they execute such violence while leaving the children unharmed? How had a family, ordinary and unassuming, become the target of such calculated aggression? The scene also highlighted the stark contrast between life and death. The children's untouched rooms, bunk beds neatly made, toys scattered as if in a casual, daily rhythm, stood in sharp juxtaposition to the brutality upstairs. It was a visual and emotional reminder that violence does not exist in isolation. It affects survivors, communities, and families in ways that ripple far beyond the immediate act. Investigators knew early on that this would not be a simple case. The lack of robbery, the absence of forced entry, the targeted nature of the murders, and the survival of the children all pointed to someone who knew the family intimately. This was not a random act of violence. It was personal, premeditated, and terrifyingly deliberate. As the welfare check concluded, law enforcement quickly began canvassing neighbors, interviewing friends and family, and tracing any possible leads. Every detail, from recent conflicts to past relationships, would become important. Whoever committed this crime had not only taken 2 lives, but had left behind 2 children who depended on justice for safety, security, and closure. By the end of that day, the Tepe murders had transformed from a local tragedy into a story that would grip the nation. The scene, though silent, screamed of planning, control, and deep-seated motive. And though the children survived, the question on everyone's mind was clear. Who could commit such violence and why? The discovery of the crime set the tone for the investigation. Meticulous, intense, and emotionally charged. Every step from that morning forward would be guided by the knowledge that this was not a random event, and that the answers lay in understanding the people involved, the victims, the children, and eventually the suspect who would emerge from Monique's past. In the coming weeks, investigators would uncover patterns, threats, and evidence that would point to someone very specific. A figure from Monique's past whose obsession and unresolved anger would eventually lead them to commit an act so calculated it would shock everyone who knew the Tepe family. The quiet Columbus Street that morning became the starting point for a case defined by precision, obsession, and tragedy. From the first moments of discovery, the investigation was not only about solving a crime. It was about understanding the depths of human behavior, the dangers of unresolved conflict, and the devastating consequences of obsession left unchecked. In the days following the discovery of Monique and Spencer Tepe's bodies, Columbus was gripped by a mixture of grief, disbelief, and fear. Neighbors who had walked past the Tepe home every day, who had waved at Spencer on his morning commutes or watched Monique organize school projects on the front porch, were suddenly forced to confront a horrifying reality. 2 lives had been violently stolen, inside a home that once radiated ordinary warmth. As investigators pored over the crime scene, the details, or lack thereof, began to raise questions that would shape the early trajectory of the case. There was no forced entry, no signs of a struggle. Nothing had been stolen. Everything in the home was precisely as it had been left the night before. From the outside, it appeared as if the Tepe family had simply vanished, leaving behind only a chilling message in the form of 2 executed lives. But detectives quickly realized that appearances can be deceiving. The absence of typical crime indicators, broken doors, missing valuables, ransacked furniture, was not reassuring. On the contrary, it was a red flag. Crimes that appear too clean often indicate planning, intent, and intimate knowledge of the victim's routines. Early on, investigators asked, who had access to the house? Who knew when Monique and Spencer would be home or away? Could someone have observed their routines for weeks or months, studying their habits, their movements, their children's schedules? These were not easy questions because the answers would take detectives deep into the Tepe family's past, beyond what was visible in the present. Family members and close friends were interviewed. They described the Tepe home as a place of calm and stability. There had been no recent conflicts, no obvious threats, and no known disputes that could explain the level of violence inflicted. This only deepened the sense of unease. How could a loving, stable family, embedded in their community and protected by routine, become the target of such an act? The investigators quickly realized that the focus had to shift away from random acts of violence. Columbus had its share of burglaries and street crimes, but the precision of this attack suggested a personal connection. Someone had entered with purpose, someone who knew exactly how to carry out the murders without attracting attention, without disturbing the children, and without leaving physical signs of forced entry. Neighborhood canvasses were conducted. Residents were asked to recall any unusual activity in the weeks leading up to the murders. Mail carriers, delivery personnel, and neighbors provided testimony about people seen near the home at odd hours. Though most recollections were vague, patterns began to emerge, small glimpses of activity that, at first glance, had seemed innocuous. Detectives also scrutinized the family's digital footprint. Phone records, emails, and social media interactions were reviewed for any threats, conflicts, or unusual communications. In cases like this, digital evidence often holds subtle clues, repeated calls from unknown numbers, unusual location data, or even a seemingly ordinary message that, in context, reveals a hidden tension. As investigators delved into the Tepe's social circle, one question became increasingly urgent. Who could harbor such deep-seated motive, combined with the audacity and ability to carry out these murders flawlessly? The clean nature of the crime scene suggested familiarity, but motive was still elusive. Random violence didn't fit. This was deliberate, and the answer lay within the family's past, relationships that may have left lingering resentment, obsession, or control issues. Meanwhile, the community struggled to process the shock. Parents worried about their own children. Neighbors felt a sudden vulnerability in what had always been considered a safe area. The fact that the Tepe children had survived was both miraculous and haunting. What if the next crime did not leave children untouched? The sense of security that had once defined their streets had been irrevocably shaken. Red flags emerged not just from the physical evidence, but from the emotional patterns surrounding the family. Friends recalled incidents where Monique had been cautious around certain individuals, incidents that at the time had seemed minor, almost trivial, but now took on a grim significance. There were whispered concerns about controlling behavior, lingering resentments, and unresolved conflicts in Monique's past relationships. In the investigative world, cases like this follow a familiar trajectory. Start with access, then motive, then opportunity. The Tepe murders had all three elements obscured in a seemingly ordinary household. Access was intimate. Someone knew the home well enough to enter undetected. Motive was personal, an emotional connection that went beyond material gain. Opportunity had been calculated. The timing, the absence of chaos, the fact that the children were unharmed, all pointed to someone who had studied the family, the home, and their routines. As detectives traced these threads, one figure began to loom larger with each interview. Someone from Monique's past, someone whose presence had left traces of tension, fear, and unresolved conflict. At first, this individual was only a name in the background, a shadow in family stories. But as evidence accumulated, that shadow became sharper, darker, and impossible to ignore. The early questions, the red flags, and the unsettling calm of the crime scene all pointed toward a chilling conclusion. This murder was not spontaneous. It was planned, intimate, and deliberate. It was a crime born not from chance, but from obsession and resentment. And it was about to reveal a past that the Tepe family had hoped was behind them. As investigators continued piecing together the Tepe murders, one fact became increasingly impossible to ignore. This was a crime rooted in personal history. The lack of forced entry, the calm, precise execution, and the survival of the children all pointed towards someone who knew the family intimately. And the past that would eventually lead detectives to the prime suspect was Monique's, specifically her former marriage. Michael McKee, Monique's ex-husband, emerged from the shadows of her past. On paper, McKee appeared respectable. A vascular surgeon living out of state, he was highly educated, disciplined, and seemingly successful. Professionally, he had earned the respect of colleagues and patients alike. Socially, he was polite and controlled, but investigators knew that appearances can be deceiving. Personal relationships often hold secrets that professional accomplishments cannot hide. Monique and McKee's marriage had been brief, but it had been turbulent. Those close to the couple recall tension, arguments, and disagreements that had escalated to the point of dissolution. The divorce, finalized years earlier, had been difficult, but what some had believed to be a closed chapter, investigators now realized, may have been far from over. Friends and family later revealed that McKee had struggled to let go of the relationship. His behavior following the divorce suggested lingering obsession and resentment. In private conversations, he was reported to have made statements implying that Monique would never fully escape him, that she would always be within his reach, no matter how far she moved or whom she married afterward. These were not idle words. They were warnings, foreshadowing the potential for extreme action, and they painted a picture of a man whose sense of control had become dangerously entwined with personal obsession. Investigators began tracing McKee's movements, communications, and interactions over the years. Though he lived out of state, digital footprints and witness reports suggested he had maintained a level of surveillance over Monique's life, even after the divorce. He seemed to know her routines, her patterns, and, crucially, her vulnerabilities. This knowledge would soon become central to understanding how the murders had been executed with such chilling precision. For law enforcement, connecting McKee to the Tepe murders was not about speculation. It required evidence, pattern analysis, and careful reconstruction of timelines. Investigators looked at prior interactions, disputes, and any hints of threats. Friends recounted moments when Monique expressed discomfort or concern over McKee's behavior, though at the time, these concerns had been dismissed as residual tension from a past relationship. In retrospect, they formed a mosaic of red flags that were impossible to ignore. By now, the investigators were focused on motive. McKee's history offered a plausible explanation: unresolved obsession, rejection, and perhaps a desire to regain a sense of control. The precise targeting of Monique and Spencer, coupled with the survival of the children, suggested a personal vendetta rather than random malice. It was the kind of motive that investigators in domestic violence cases learn to recognize: long-standing emotional fixation that can escalate to violence when left unchecked. The focus on McKee intensified as detectives cross-referenced locations, communications, and financial activity. It wasn't enough to know that he had motive. They needed proof of opportunity and planning. But every thread they pulled, from friends' testimonies to travel records and digital surveillance, began to point to one unsettling conclusion. Someone from Monique's past had not moved on, and that lingering obsession had potentially set the stage for tragedy. Community members, still reeling from the shock of the murders, were stunned to learn that the investigation was turning inward. This was no longer a case about a random intruder or a burglary gone wrong. This was about a former partner, someone known, someone close, whose history with the family had created the conditions for the crime. For neighbors, the idea that danger could come from someone the family once trusted was as unsettling as the murders themselves. Police interviews with friends and relatives painted a more complete picture. McKee, they recalled, had a reputation for being controlling, calculating, and persistent. Statements he had made in the past, though dismissed at the time as harmless, now took on a darker meaning. Observers described him as someone who struggled with the idea of loss, particularly the loss of control over Monique's life and the life they had shared. As investigators compiled their case, the focus on McKee was not just about his history. It was about opportunity and intent. The clean, calculated execution of the murders suggested forethought. Someone who knew the couple's routines, their schedules, and the layout of their home would have been able to plan with precision. McKee fit the profile perfectly. The next step for investigators would be to link him to the crime with hard evidence: surveillance footage, digital footprints, and potential eyewitness accounts. The tension in Columbus grew as the focus on McKee became public knowledge. Residents began to understand the chilling reality of domestic obsession, the way unresolved emotional fixation can fester and escalate, leaving destruction in its wake. While McKee had maintained a professional and controlled exterior, the personal history suggested a volatility that, left unchecked, could have catastrophic consequences. By the time McKee became the prime suspect, law enforcement had a clear path forward: establish a timeline of his movements, document prior threats or troubling behavior, and find concrete evidence connecting him to the Tepe home on the day of, or before, the murders. The stage was set for the next phase of the investigation, where digital surveillance and prior warning signs would converge, revealing the meticulous planning behind the tragedy. The Tepe murders were no longer a puzzle of random violence. They were the culmination of a long history of obsession, control, and resentment. McKee was no longer a shadow in the background. He had become the central figure in a case that was about to expose the darkest extremes of personal fixation. As the investigation into the Tepe murders progressed, detectives were digging deeper into every angle of Monique and Spencer's lives. But one question loomed larger than all others: how had the killer entered and executed the crime with such precision? The lack of forced entry and the untouched household suggested someone with intimate knowledge, someone who had carefully studied the family's routines. But proving it, that required evidence. Concrete, undeniable proof. And that proof began to surface through surveillance footage. Weeks before the murders, investigators discovered that cameras in the neighborhood had captured unusual activity near the Tepe home. One sequence in particular stood out. Michael McKee, Monique's ex-husband, had been seen walking near the property on a day when the couple had been away at a football game. At first, it seemed incidental. After all, it was possible for a former spouse to pass by the neighborhood. But detectives noted the timing, the direction of travel, and the repeated presence over multiple days. As they analyzed the footage frame by frame, a troubling picture emerged. McKee had not simply walked past the home. He appeared to be observing, surveying, and noting details. The footage suggested that he may have entered the property while the Tepe family was away, a visit that investigators believed could have been used to gather information about the house's layout, entry points, and security measures. This discovery dramatically altered the understanding of the case. The murders were no longer seen as a sudden, impulsive act of rage or opportunity. They were pre-planned, deliberate, and calculated. Someone had spent time preparing, learning the rhythms of the household, and waiting for the right moment to strike. The presence of surveillance evidence provided investigators with the first concrete link between the suspect and the crime scene. In addition to physical surveillance, digital footprints reinforced the narrative of planning. Phone location data, travel records, and credit card activity all suggested that McKee had been in the vicinity more than once during the weeks leading up to the murders. Investigators were piecing together a pattern of behavior that revealed someone obsessively focused on the family, someone unwilling to let go, and someone willing to act on that fixation with deadly intent. Detectives also began reviewing footage from other locations near the Tepe home, looking for movements that could indicate recon visits. Patterns of behavior emerged that painted a clear picture of preparation. Times of day when the family was likely to be out, areas where the children played outside, and routes for entering and exiting the property unnoticed. It was methodical, precise, and terrifying in its implication. The surveillance evidence had another chilling dimension. It suggested forethought about the children. The visits occurred when the family was away, when the parents were not present, indicating a focus on the adults while leaving the children unharmed. This was not a random act of chaos. It was selective, intentional, and controlled. The killer's knowledge extended beyond the physical space of the house. It extended to the lives of the people inside it, their schedules, and their vulnerabilities. Court filings later revealed how critical this surveillance footage would become in the prosecution's case. It connected McKee directly to the vicinity of the Tepe home in a way that circumstantial evidence could not. Investigators argued that the footage demonstrated reconnaissance, premeditation, and a pattern of obsession, all factors that would form the backbone of the charges against him. The discovery of these details also shifted the timeline of the investigation. Detectives began looking at days and weeks leading up to the murders with renewed scrutiny. They identified opportunities when the family had been away, noting patterns of activity that could have provided a window for McKee to gather information and prepare. The case transformed from a tragic murder investigation into a story of obsession and methodical planning, where every action was deliberate, calculated, and ultimately deadly. The presence of surveillance evidence not only strengthened the case legally, it also highlighted the psychological profile of the suspect. Someone willing to surveil a former spouse, to study their routines, and to act only when conditions were optimal, demonstrated not just anger, but obsessive control, patience, and calculation. It was a portrait of a killer who saw the act as a mission, a resolution of a long-standing emotional fixation, rather than a spontaneous outburst. For the Tepe family, and for the investigators tasked with seeking justice, this evidence was a turning point. It provided a concrete link between McKee and the crime, offering clarity in a case that had been shrouded in uncertainty. The previously unanswered questions, who, how, and why, now had pieces that fit together. The pattern of premeditation was undeniable, and the law enforcement team could begin to outline the case for prosecution with precision. But while the surveillance footage offered insight into the killer's planning, it also added a layer of dread. It revealed the cold, deliberate nature of the crime and the extent to which someone could allow obsession to dictate deadly action. It reminded the community that danger often hides in plain sight, masked by familiarity, relationships, and routine. The discovery of this evidence set the stage for the next crucial chapter in the case, connecting the dots between past behavior, threats, and the meticulous planning revealed on camera. What had once been a series of questions and red flags was now becoming a clear trajectory pointing toward McKee, and the arrest that would soon follow would transform speculation into confrontation. The surveillance evidence did more than help build a legal case. It told a story of obsession, control, and deliberate violence. It revealed the method behind the horror, and it underscored a chilling reality. The Tepe murders were not an act of chance, but a calculated culmination of a long-standing fixation. Every step McKee took in those weeks before the crime had been deliberate, every visit intentional, and every movement a prelude to tragedy. While surveillance footage and digital evidence began to outline the mechanics of the crime, investigators quickly realized that understanding why it happened required delving deeper into the history between Monique Tepe and Michael McKee. This was no ordinary domestic dispute, no fleeting argument. The threads of tension, control, and obsession stretched back years, hidden beneath the veneer of normalcy, yet ever present in subtle warnings that, at the time, had gone largely unheeded. Friends and family later revealed that Monique had, for years, expressed concerns about McKee's controlling behavior. Even after the marriage ended, she reportedly felt monitored, pressured, and, at times, unsafe. She confided in trusted friends and relatives that Michael had a tendency to insert himself into her life in ways that were intrusive and unsettling. The divorce may have ended their legal ties, but according to those who knew her well, the emotional and psychological impact lingered, and it lingered heavily. Witnesses recounted moments that, in hindsight, were deeply alarming. On several occasions, McKee allegedly made statements that suggested a sense of ownership or control over Monique, even after the marriage had ended. Friends reported him saying things like, "She'll never really be free from me," or "I could find her anywhere, anytime." At the time, these comments may have seemed dramatic, even theatrical, but investigators now recognize them as ominous warnings of a pattern of obsession. This history painted a portrait of a man who struggled to relinquish control. Where Monique sought independence and a fresh start, McKee's actions suggested that he could not accept the life she had built with Spencer. His inability to let go transformed from emotional fixation into threatening behavior, creating an undercurrent of fear that, tragically, would culminate in violence. Investigators also explored McKee's professional and social life to understand the psychological dimensions of the case. As a vascular surgeon, he maintained a disciplined, controlled, and highly organized exterior. But discipline in one area of life does not preclude dangerous behavior in another, and in McKee's case, his meticulousness appeared to extend to his obsession. Friends and family described a man who, when confronted with rejection or loss of control, could become calculating, persistent, and even vindictive. One of the most chilling aspects of this history was the contrast between McKee's outward persona and his private behavior. In public, he appeared composed, rational, and socially acceptable. Behind closed doors, however, he reportedly displayed controlling tendencies, emotional manipulation, and intimidation. This duality made him difficult to predict and harder for investigators to understand, until the tragic outcome made the consequences painfully clear. The prior threats and alleged controlling behavior became a critical part of the legal narrative. Prosecutors later emphasized these details to illustrate motive. McKee's inability to accept the end of the marriage, his obsessive focus on Monique, and his apparent fixation on the family she had built with Spencer. These were not the actions of someone reacting in a moment of rage. They were the culmination of long-standing resentment and obsession, carefully masked by years of outward normalcy. Family members and friends also described incidents where McKee's presence, or perceived presence, caused Monique genuine anxiety. Whether it was unexpected visits, unsolicited calls, or hints that he knew her whereabouts, the accumulation of these behaviors suggested a pattern that escalated over time. To investigators, this pattern was a predictor of potential escalation, and unfortunately, the escalation came in the form of murder. Psychologists often describe such behavior as a blend of obsessive relational thinking and controlling tendencies, where the perpetrator views rejection not as a natural boundary, but as a personal affront. In McKee's case, his inability to accept the divorce and Monique's new life may have evolved into a pathological need to assert dominance and control, which tragically manifested in the lethal act that claimed 2 lives. The community, once shocked by the methodical nature of the murders, now began to grasp the emotional calculus behind them. This was not a spontaneous act of violence. It was the final chapter in a prolonged psychological struggle, a story of obsession, power, and unresolved conflict that had festered over years. The danger, investigators noted, had always been present, hidden in the background, until it erupted with irreversible consequences. For law enforcement, these revelations were crucial. They contextualized the surveillance footage, the timing of the murders, and the precision of the crime scene. McKee's history of threats and controlling behavior suggested intentionality, reinforcing the argument that this was a premeditated act. Every piece of prior behavior became evidence of motive. Every prior statement a foreshadowing of tragedy. In court filings and later testimonies, prosecutors would emphasize the psychological and historical context of McKee's actions. Witness accounts, combined with surveillance evidence, created a multi-dimensional case that depicted not just the mechanics of the crime, but the human story behind it. A man unable to accept loss, a mother trying to move on, and a blended family caught in the crossfire of obsession and violence. By the time investigators were ready to make an arrest, the picture was clear. McKee's prior behavior, his alleged threats, and the pattern of obsession provided a chilling narrative. This was a man who had planned, surveilled, and ultimately executed a crime against those he once claimed to love. The tragedy was not a product of random chance. It was the culmination of years of unresolved conflict, obsession, and escalating control. This history also served as a warning. Often, the signs are present long before tragedy occurs. Friends, family, and professionals can detect patterns of obsession intimidation, or controlling behavior. But without intervention, those patterns can escalate with devastating consequences. In the Tepe case, those warning signs were tragically unheeded, and the outcome was a violent, irreversible act that left a family shattered and a community in mourning. As the investigation shifted toward arrest and prosecution, McKee's troubling history and alleged threats were central to understanding the crime. They transformed the narrative from a simple question of into a deeper exploration of why this violence occurred, revealing the destructive potential of unresolved obsession and the chilling reality that domestic disputes can sometimes escalate into fatal outcomes. After weeks of meticulous investigation, surveillance analysis, and piecing together Michael McKee's troubling history with Monique Tepe, law enforcement was finally ready to take action. The weight of evidence, digital footprints, surveillance footage, witness testimony, and accounts of past threats painted a damning portrait. McKee was no longer just a person of interest. He had become the prime suspect, the man at the center of a tragedy that had shaken Columbus to its core. The arrest was carried out in Illinois, where McKee had been residing. Detectives coordinated carefully, aware that the suspect was a trained professional accustomed to structure, control, and precision. There could be no room for error. They needed to take him into custody safely, decisively, and without alerting him in a way that could jeopardize the case or endanger anyone involved. When officers approached him, McKee was calm. He did not resist, argue, or attempt to flee. The arrest, executed with precision and professionalism, marked the first moment in weeks when the city could feel a semblance of justice beginning to take shape. McKee was handcuffed, read his rights, and escorted into custody. There was no public spectacle, no confrontation, just the quiet gravity of a moment years in the making. From Illinois, McKee was extradited to Ohio, where the full weight of the legal system would begin to bear down. Prosecutors charged him with multiple counts of aggravated murder and aggravated burglary. Serious, high-stakes charges reflecting the premeditated and targeted nature of the crime. The legal team framed the charges around both the murder of Monique and Spencer Tepe and the deliberate intrusion into their home, highlighting the calculated control exercised by the suspect. At his first court appearance in Ohio, McKee entered a plea of not guilty. His calm demeanor in court contrasted starkly with the intensity of the charges and the emotional gravity of the situation. Observers noted that while the arrest and charges were momentous, the legal process had just begun, a process that would involve months, perhaps years, of investigation, testimony, and courtroom strategy. The arrest marked a turning point for the investigation. What had been speculation, suspicion, and a web of circumstantial evidence was now anchored by the reality of a specific individual in custody. Investigators could now pursue the next phases of the case with clarity, focusing on building a prosecution supported by the surveillance footage, digital records, and witness statements that had gradually painted the portrait of a man capable of committing such violence. For the Tepe children and their extended family, the arrest brought a mix of emotions. Relief that the alleged perpetrator was in custody, fear of what the trial might reveal, and sorrow for the lives already lost all coexisted. It was a reminder that while law enforcement could act decisively, the human consequences of McKee's actions were enduring. The children had survived the immediate violence, but the psychological impact of losing both parents in such a brutal, calculated act would echo through their lives indefinitely. The community, too, reacted to the news with a complex mix of emotions. Neighbors, colleagues, and friends who had followed the investigation now saw the suspect identified and arrested, yet the shock remained palpable. The case had transformed from a mysterious, almost unsolvable puzzle into a legal drama that would unfold in a public courtroom. While arrests often signify closure in crime dramas and news reports, in reality, they mark the beginning of a long, grueling pursuit of justice. For law enforcement, the arrest was also a validation of months of meticulous detective work. Every lead had been followed, every witness interviewed, and every digital trace examined. The team's ability to connect McKee to the crime, through surveillance footage, travel records, and corroborated statements, demonstrated the importance of methodical, patient investigation in cases involving premeditated, intimate crimes. However, while the arrest was a significant milestone, investigators knew that the journey was far from over. Gathering evidence for trial, coordinating expert testimony, and preparing for defense strategies were all critical next steps. McKee's not guilty plea meant that the courtroom, not just law enforcement, would become the arena where justice would be contested. The story, tragic and intricate, was far from concluded. In the public eye, the arrest brought a mix of closure and renewed anxiety. The knowledge that the suspect was in custody provided some comfort, yet the details of premeditation, obsession, and the calculated nature of the murders highlighted the disturbing reality that such violence can originate from someone familiar, someone once trusted, and someone whose behavior had been a slow-burning threat for years. Ultimately, McKee's arrest was both an end and a beginning. It ended his freedom and removed the immediate threat to the surviving children. But it marked the beginning of a high-stakes legal battle, a courtroom struggle to bring accountability, and a prolonged process of healing for the Tepe family and community. The arrest crystallized what investigators had suspected all along. The Tepe murders were not random, not impulsive, and not without warning. They were the tragic culmination of obsession, control, and unresolved conflict. As the case moved forward, the arrest served as a reminder of the painstaking work required in cases of domestic violence and targeted murder. Every witness statement, every surveillance frame, and every historical detail played a role in building a narrative that could withstand legal scrutiny. The arrest was significant, yes, but the work to ensure justice for Monique and Spencer Tepe had only just begun. With Michael McKee in custody, the Tepe murder case entered a new phase. The initial shock of the killings had transformed into a painstaking legal process, and the city of Columbus waited anxiously as the wheels of justice began to turn. While the arrest was a major milestone, it was only the beginning of a complex journey, a journey that involved building an airtight case, presenting compelling evidence, and navigating the strategies of a defense determined to challenge every claim. Today, McKee remains in custody without bond, a decision reflecting both the severity of the charges and the calculated nature of the crime. Prosecutors have painted him as a meticulous, obsessive individual whose past behavior, surveillance activities, and apparent fixation on Monique Tepe culminated in a premeditated act of murder. Every element of the investigation, from digital evidence to witness testimony, has been organized to demonstrate planning, intent, and execution, leaving little room for interpretation that this was anything other than deliberate. The prosecution's strategy revolves around multiple pillars. Surveillance footage remains central, showing McKee near the Tepe home weeks before the murders and suggesting reconnaissance and premeditation. Digital records, including location data and travel activity, corroborate the timeline and place him in proximity at critical times. Witness testimony from friends, family, and neighbors underscores the history of threats, controlling behavior, and obsession, building a profile of motive that aligns chillingly with the eventual outcome. Meanwhile, the defense has remained consistent in its stance. McKee pleads not guilty. His legal team is likely to scrutinize the evidence, challenge interpretations of past behavior, and argue for alternative explanations. In cases like this, the courtroom becomes more than a venue for justice. It becomes a battleground of narratives, where intent, credibility, and interpretation of evidence are weighed against one another. Every surveillance clip, every witness account, and every historical detail is subject to rigorous examination and debate. For the Tepe children, the ongoing proceedings are a reminder of the fragility of safety and the complexity of justice. While they survived the immediate violence, their lives are now entwined with a legal process that is both protective and prolonged. The psychological impact of losing both parents in such a brutal, calculated act is profound, and the case's progression in court may provide answers but will never erase the trauma. The community remains deeply invested. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers have followed the story closely, seeking to understand how such violence could occur in what was once considered a safe and stable environment. The case has prompted conversations about warning signs in domestic situations, the importance of reporting threats, and the need for vigilance when patterns of obsession, control, or harassment emerge. Legally, the case is still developing. Pretrial motions, evidence disclosures, and procedural hearings continue, each step critical to shaping the trial. Prosecutors are methodically building their narrative, connecting historical patterns, threats, and surveillance to establish motive, opportunity, and premeditation. The defense, on the other hand, is preparing to challenge interpretations, question witness credibility, and dissect every technical detail of the surveillance and digital evidence. Public attention has remained intense, but the city's response has been remarkably measured, reflecting both respect for due process and recognition of the tragedy. Law enforcement continues to emphasize that while arrests provide a sense of progress, true resolution will come only through a comprehensive, transparent, and fair trial, one that presents the facts clearly and allows the legal system to render its judgment. At this stage, investigators remain vigilant. Even with McKee in custody, they continue to review evidence, interview potential witnesses, and analyze any new information that may arise. Every detail counts in a case so tightly connected to personal history, obsession, and methodical planning. The goal is not only to secure justice for Monique and Spencer Tepe, but also to ensure that every aspect of the crime is fully understood, documented, and addressed. The Tepe case now stands as a sobering example of how domestic tension, unresolved obsession, and prior threats can escalate into calculated, tragic violence. The story is far from over. The trial looms ahead, promising months of examination, revelation, and legal confrontation. McKee's fate and the community's sense of closure will ultimately depend on how the court interprets the intricate mosaic of evidence, testimony, and historical context that has been painstakingly compiled. For the public, this stage of the case is a reminder. Justice is a process, not a moment. The arrest may bring immediate relief, but understanding, accountability, and closure require patience, meticulous legal work, and careful evaluation of every piece of the puzzle. As the trial approaches, all eyes remain fixed on the courtroom, waiting to see how the culmination of surveillance, history, and testimony will shape the ultimate outcome. In essence, the Tepe case today is a snapshot of both the triumphs and limits of investigation. Law enforcement has acted decisively, evidence has been collected and preserved, and the alleged perpetrator is in custody. Yet the emotional, psychological, and social ramifications continue to ripple outward, reminding everyone that the consequences of obsession and violence extend far beyond the immediate act. As the dust of the investigation settles into the courtroom, the Tepe murders leave a lingering shadow over Columbus, Ohio. The tragedy, while deeply personal, is also a stark illustration of the destructive potential of unresolved conflict, obsession, and domestic abuse. Behind every statistic, every news headline, and every police report are real lives. Lives shaped, disrupted, and sometimes destroyed. Monique and Spencer Tepe were not just victims. They were parents, partners, and members of a community that now bears the weight of their loss. Reflecting on the case, one cannot ignore the patterns that foreshadowed the violence. Michael McKee's controlling behavior, the alleged threats, the surveillance, and the premeditated planning paint a vivid picture of how obsession can evolve from emotional fixation into calculated harm. These warning signs, often subtle or dismissed at the time, accumulated over years until they culminated in a moment of irreversible tragedy. It is a sobering reminder that violence rarely emerges spontaneously. More often, it is the climax of escalating behavior that was ignored or underestimated. For the Tepe children, survival does not erase the trauma. They woke from a nightmare that would forever define their sense of safety, trust, and family. While their parents' deaths are permanent, the hope for justice lies in the meticulous work of investigators, prosecutors, and the legal system. Every surveillance clip, witness statement, and piece of digital evidence collected in this case is not just a tool for conviction. It is a shield for the surviving family, a means of holding the perpetrator accountable, and a record for history. The community, too, must grapple with the chilling reality that domestic violence and obsession often occur behind closed doors, hidden beneath facades of normalcy and respectability. The Tepe case illustrates that danger can come from someone known, someone trusted, someone whose presence in your life is assumed safe. Awareness, vigilance, and intervention are critical, not just for law enforcement, but for neighbors, friends, and family members who may notice the subtle signs of escalating control or threats. As the trial approaches, the story of Monique and Spencer reminds us that justice is rarely instantaneous. Arrests, charges, and court proceedings are steps along a long, painstaking path. They are milestones in a process that must balance emotional urgency with legal rigor, evidence with interpretation, and closure with fairness. The outcome of the trial will shape not only McKee's future, but also the narrative of accountability, warning, and prevention that this case represents. For viewers of Real Crime Saga, the Tepe case is more than a headline. It is a lens into the complexities of human relationships, the consequences of unresolved obsession, and the necessity of awareness. It is a reminder to pay attention to warning signs in relationships, to take threats seriously, and to recognize that intervention can sometimes prevent tragedies that might otherwise seem unavoidable. Ultimately, the story of Monique and Spencer Tepe is both tragic and instructive. It reveals how ordinary lives, filled with love, routine, and family bonds, can be shattered by the unseen forces of obsession, resentment, and unresolved conflict. It underscores the fragility of safety, the lasting consequences of control, and the need for vigilance in protecting those we care about most. As this case continues to unfold, we invite you, our viewers, to reflect. Think about the signs that often precede violence. Consider the ways communities, families, and friends can act to prevent escalation. And remember that behind every crime story, there are real people, real families, and children whose lives are changed forever. If you found this story compelling, make sure to subscribe to Real Crime Saga and hit the notification bell. Stay with us as we continue to follow the Tepe case, breaking down every update, court filing, and revelation in real time. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your insight, questions, and reflections help us create a community that learns from these stories, not just watches them. The Tepe murders are a testament to both the danger of obsession and the importance of awareness, preparation, and justice. Monique and Spencer's story will remain with us as a cautionary tale and a call to vigilance. And as we watch the legal process unfold, we do so with the hope that justice, accountability, and healing will ultimately prevail for the family and the community that love them.